The night my husband told me to sleep in the guest room, he did it in front of 14 people. I can still hear the laughter, not loud laughter, not the kind that comes from a joke, the uncomfortable kind. The kind people use when they don't know what else to do. We were hosting a dinner party for his coworkers. The dining room smelled like rosemary chicken and expensive red wine. I'd spent 2 days preparing everything. The table was set with my grandmother's china. Candles flickered softly between crystal glasses, and there I stood, holding a serving tray, like hired help. My husband, Derek, leaned back in his chair and loosened his tie. "Actually," he said, taking a sip of wine, "I think Claire should sleep in the guest room tonight." The room went silent. I forced a laugh. "What?" "You heard me." His tone wasn't playful. Several guests looked away. My stomach tightened. "Derek." "Stop. No, seriously." He pointed his fork at me. "I've got an early meeting. You toss around all night. The guest room exists for a reason." Heat rushed into my face. "Can we discuss this later?" "We're discussing it now." One of his coworkers shifted uncomfortably. A woman named Amanda looked horrified. But nobody said anything, because Derek had money, is power. People rarely challenge men like that. I set the tray down before my hands could start shaking. For 14 years, I'd been married to him. 14 years of little humiliations disguised as jokes. 14 years of being corrected in public, interrupted, dismissed, treated like an accessory. Every time I complained, he had the same answer. "You're too sensitive." I looked around the table. Nobody would help me. Nobody ever did. So I smiled, a small, controlled smile. "Of course, Derek." His grin widened. He loved winning. What he didn't know was that this would be the last victory he'd ever have over me. I just didn't know it yet. That realization would come later, at exactly 11:42 p.m., the moment that changed everything. The guests left around 10. I cleaned the kitchen alone, as usual. Derek disappeared into our bedroom without lifting a finger. Agon, as usual. The dishwasher hummed softly while I scrubbed a roasting pan. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. My shoulders ached, my feet hurt, and something inside me felt exhausted in a way sleep could never fix. The truth was, I hadn't been happy in years. I just kept convincing myself things would improve, maybe after his promotion, maybe after we paid off debt, maybe after he became less stressed. Maybe. Women can survive on maybe for an astonishing amount of time. Eventually, though, reality catches up. Mine had been catching up for years. Derek controlled everything, the finances, the schedules, the decisions. Even conversations somehow revolved around him. Friends joked that he was particular. I knew a better word, controlling. At 10:45, I carried my overnight bag to the guest room. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old books. I sat on the edge of the bed. For a moment, I simply stared at the wall. Then I cried, not dramatically, not loudly, just silent tears sliding down my face. The kind that come when you're too tired to fight anymore. After a few minutes, I wiped my eyes and laughed bitterly. Imagine being kicked out of your own bedroom in your own house. My own house. The phrase lingered in my mind, for reasons I couldn't explain. I shook it off, then my phone buzzed an unknown number. Normally, I would have ignored it. Something made me answer. "Hello, Claire Morgan?" "Yes." "Hi, this is Susan Parker from Parker and Wells Legal." I frowned. "I think you have the wrong number. I don't believe so. We've been trying to reach you regarding property documentation." "Property documentation? What property?" A pause. "The residence is located on Willow Creek Drive." My heart skipped. That was our address. My husband handles all property matters. Another pause, longer this time. Then Susan said something that made my entire body go still. "Mrs. Morgan, according to county records, you are the sole owner of that property." I laughed. Actually laughed, because it sounded absurd. "No, yes. No, my husband bought the house. That's not what the records indicate." The room suddenly felt very small, very quiet. "What records?" Your grandfather transferred the property into a trust 21 years ago. I stopped breathing. My grandfather. The words hit me like ice water. He died shortly before my wedding. I remembered paperwork, meetings, dockets, things I'd signed while grieving, things I barely understood at the time. Susan continued. The trust dissolved 3 years ago. Full ownership transferred directly to you. I gripped the phone tighter. Are you saying my husband isn't on the deed? Correct. A chill spread through my chest. Derek handles everything. Then he may already know. The moment she said it, I knew. He knew. He absolutely knew. And somehow that realization felt worse than the humiliation at dinner, because it meant years of deception. Years. After hanging up, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark guest room, staring at the rain. Questions kept crashing through my mind. If Derek knew, why hide it? Why pretend the house belonged to both of us? Why control every financial decision? Why constantly remind me how much I depended on him? Around midnight, I opened my laptop. My hands trembled. County property records were public. A few searches later, I found the deed. There it was, clear as day. Owner, Claire Elizabeth Morgan. No Derek. No joint ownership. Just me. I felt sick, then angry, then something else. Something dangerous, because for the first time in years, I realized I wasn't trapped, not financially, not legally, not nearly as much as he'd convinced me. And once that realization took hold, I couldn't let it go. I kept digging. Property records led to trust documents. Trust documents led to attorney correspondence. Attorney correspondence led to something even bigger, something Derek never intended for me to discover. At 1:17 a.m., I found one email buried among old legal files. The subject line made my stomach drop. Ownership clarification requested by Derek Morgan. My pulse was hammered. I clicked. And what I read changed everything. Not only had Derek known the house belonged to me, he'd spent years trying to find a way to take it. And the email trail proved it. Every single word, every request, every strategy, documented, saved. Waiting for someone to uncover it, waiting for me. I stared at the screen while rain rattled the windows. Down the hall, Derek slept peacefully, certain he was in control, certain I was exactly where he wanted me. The guest room. Out of the way, obedient, defeated. I looked toward the closed door, then back at the evidence glowing on my screen. A slow smile spread across my face. For the first time in 14 years, I wasn't crying. I was planning. And Derek had no idea what was coming. The next morning, I acted exactly the way Derek expected. That was the hardest part. I made coffee. I toasted bagels. I packed his lunch. When he walked into the kitchen, he barely glanced at me. Like a king inspecting a servant. Feeling better? He asked. I spread cream cheese on a bagel. About what? Last night, I shrugged. It was fine. The surprise flashed across his face for half a second. He'd expected tears. An argument, a confrontation. Instead, I handed him a travel mug. Good luck at your meeting. His eyes narrowed slightly. Derek didn't trust calm. He trusted weakness, and I wasn't giving him any. After he left, I immediately called Susan Parker back. Within an hour, I was sitting in her office. She was in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She spread documents across a conference table. Before we continue, she said, I need to ask something. I nodded. Did your husband ever tell you about these records? No? Not once? No. She exchanged a glance with her assistant. That look told me more than words. What? Susan folded her hands. Claire, your grandfather was very specific. I leaned forward. He worried about financial manipulation. The room seemed to tilt. My grandfather? Yes. She opened a file. Inside was a handwritten letter, his handwriting. I recognized it immediately. My chest tightened. I haven't seen that in years. He instructed us to preserve it. Susan slid it toward me. My fingers trembled as I read. Claire, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. There is something I need you to understand. People change when money is involved. even good people, especially people who want power. The Willow Creek property belongs to you and only you. Protect it. Never surrender ownership because someone convinces you that love requires sacrifice. The right person will never ask for that. Tears blurred the words. I stared at the page. My grandfather had seen something. Maybe not Derek specifically, but something enough to leave warnings, enough to build legal protections. Suzanne quietly waited while I collected myself. Then she opened another folder. And that's when things became much worse. Derek contacted multiple attorneys. I looked up. What do you mean? She slid copies across the table. Consultations, questions, recs. Years' worth. Most were denied. Some attorneys explicitly refused involvement. One response caught my eye. Mr. Morgan,
Entiendo,
ownership cannot be transferred
entonces
without
total,
Mrs. Morgan's informed consent. My
tengo por
stomach
aquí
twisted.
a un gato
Informed
destructor,
consent,
¿vale?
meaning
Si
he'd
escucháis
tried,
ruido,
repeatedly,
cabezazos,
without telling me how
golpes,
many times.
es él,
Susan looked
es él.
down.
Todas las
7 documented
responsabilidades a él.
attempts. 7. Not one, not two.
Estábamos.
7. The betrayal landed harder than
Ok.
anything else. Not because he failed, because he kept trying, year after year, while smiling across dinner tables, while celebrating anniversaries, while telling everyone how much he loved me. A
Poco.
man doesn't spend years trying to steal from
Ahora
someone he respects.
mismo
The drive home
lo
felt
he dicho en
surreal.
modo destructor.
I kept replaying 14
Ataca a
years of
Coco, pues entonces
marriage,
se va afuera.
moments that
Se va
suddenly
afuera
made
y lo ves poco
sense,
tiempo, ¿eh?
arguments about
Ay, míralo.
finances, pressure to sign documents quickly, his irritation whenever I asked questions, the
Le
way
quedan 2
he'd
minutos
always
aquí.
insisted on reviewing mail before I saw
Así
it.
que
I
yo que
wasn't
tú no
imagining
pedía que
things
ataque.
I never had been. The
Porque en el
realization was
momento en el que
oddly
me haga daño,
comforting,
te
painful,
va.
but comforting because crazy people don't discover evidence, victims do. And I had evidence, lots of it. By the end of the week, I found even more. The mistake
Muy
Derek
pesadito
made was
últimamente.
assuming I wasn't paying
Muy
attention.
pesadito.
The truth was, I'd been paying attention for years. I just hadn't connected the dots.
Que no me
Now
mires el
I did.
pelo.
Every piece fit, every strange conversation, every hidden account, every
¿Qué página
financial
es, tía?
decision. And then I discovered the secret credit
2
line.
minutos son mucho,
That
es
one
evidente.
nearly
Ya, pero
knocked the
normalmente
air
cuando
out of
digo que va a
me.
durar
The
5
account
minutos,
was
dura 1,
attached to
entonces
our
si digo 2
address,
minutos, dura
but
30
not in my
segundos.
name. His name only. The balance exceeded $80,000. I stared at the statement in
Está
disbelief.
envidioso de
We'd
tu champú,
supposedly been
justo eso.
tight on money for
Justo.
years. That was his favorite
¿Hasta
excuse.
qué día vas a estar
Can't take a
estudiando?
vacation.
Pues de momento no lo
Can't renovate the
sabemos. En
kitchen.
principio hasta
Can't
el día
help your
19.
sister. Money's tight.
Seguramente más.
Apparently not. The debt financed something else entirely.
El fin de
Something
directo
Derek desperately wanted. A
ya
luxury
hasta el domingo
condominium
por la tarde
downtown.
nada.
I found the purchase inquiry 3 days later. The paperwork
Me le
included
dan
a
chungazos
note.
de esos a los
Future
gatos, son
residence
increíbles.
after
No, no.
transition.
Pero
I
¿sabes qué es
read
lo
that
peor? Que llevo
sentence
unos
6
cuantos días
times. After
preocupada
transition.
porque está
Transition to
durmiendo
what?
muchísimo
My
y está todo
stomach
el día
sank.
durmiendo,
Then I found the
tumbado,
answer.
tirado.
He in a
Que
folder
antes no
labeled
dormía
tax
tanto,
records.
considero. Y
Divorce
estaba
attorney
preocupada.
consultations.
Pero claro, luego le
3
veo con
separate
los
firms.
vuelcos
3.
hechos.
I sat
Yo qué
frozen in
sé,
my
me
office
preocupo, ¿no?
chair. The
Porque
room
vamos.
suddenly felt cold. Not because he wanted a divorce. People fall out of love. That happens. What
Por eso
shattered
no
me was
estás
the
aquí hasta el
timing.
6 de
He was
julio, sí.
planning an exit
Justo.
strategy
En
while
eso
trying to
estaba
acquire my
pensando yo,
property,
fíjate.
planning a new
Justo
life,
en eso.
using my assets without my
Con el calor
knowledge,
que solo
without
queda
my
dormir. Ya,
consent,
es lo que
without enough
pienso.
respect to
Es
tell me the
cierto que
truth.
ahora mismo
I
no
looked
está
around
haciendo
the
tanto
house,
calor. O
the
sea, yo
house
ahora
I'd
mismo estoy con el
painted,
ventilador
decorated,
apagado y no tengo
maintained,
nada encendido
loved.
porque
The house
con
he
dejar la
tried to
ventana
position
abierta por las
himself to
noches se me está
take,
quedando la
the
habitación
house
a
he thought would
25 grados o
eventually
así
become
y se está
his.
bastante bien.
A strange
Y
calm
está
settled
haciendo
over
más
me,
fresco estos
not
días.
sadness, not
Entonces,
anger, something
no
clearer,
debería estar
like
durmiendo
looking through
tanto, ¿no?
clean glass after years of fog. That evening, Derek came home carrying flowers, red roses,
Parece
a
increíble. No,
dozen. I
aquí se
almost
estaba
laughed,
mejor
the
ayer.
guilt flowers. I knew them
Hoy ya
well. He handed
empezaba a
them
subir
over
otra
for
vez
you. I
las
smiled politely.
temperaturas.
Thank you. His
Pero,
eyes searched my
pero
face,
bueno.
still
Ayer creo
suspicious,
que se
still
quedó la
trying to figure out
temperatura
why I
máxima
wasn't
en
reacting.
27 y hoy
Everything
sube a
okay? Why
28,
wouldn't it be?
si no me equivoco.
Another
Sí.
pause, then he kissed my forehead. The
Así que
performance
bueno,
would have impressed
no está
anyone
mal del
watching.
todo. Quiero
A
decir,
devoted
venimos de casi
husband,
38.
thoughtful,
Entonces no
affectionate.
nos vamos
The
a
only
quejar con estas
problem,
temperaturas que están.
there was nobody watching. And I finally knew exactly who he was. That weekend, Derek made
Aunque sea
another
durmiendo lo que
mistake,
tú no
a
puedes.
very expensive mistake. He invited friends over for a barbecue, including Amanda, the same
Ahora mismo hace
coworker
19
who'd
grados,
witnessed
aquí
my
hace más fresquecito.
humiliation. I noticed her watching me throughout the afternoon,
Pero bueno, eso está bien,
concerned,
que es lo
almost
importante.
guilty.
Eso,
When
que estoy
Derek
de
went
aquí y
inside
cuando
for
estás aquí
drinks,
encima me atacas
she
menos.
approached quietly. Can I ask
Y
you
ahora lo tengo
something?
ubicado, me ataca por la espalda.
Sure, her voice dropped. Does he always talk to you that way? There it was, the question nobody had dared ask.
Ahora
I
voy a controlar.
smiled carefully. Why? She looked uncomfortable. Because people at work talk. My pulse quickened. About what? Amanda
Hmm,
hesitated. Then she said something that changed the entire game. He tells everyone the house is his. The world seemed to
Es
stop.
muerde cables,
I kept
¿vale?
my
Pues se
expression
electrocuta
neutral.
y ya está. Ese es el
Really? She
funcionamiento de
nodded
morder cables.
constantly. Interesting. Very
Yo no lo
interesting,
suelo dejar
because
por
Derek
eso,
wasn't
pero
just lying to me.
allá cada
He
uno.
was lying publicly, repeatedly, to coworkers, friends, neighbors, building a false narrative. A narrative that would become extremely important later, especially when the truth came out. Amanda lowered her voice even further. Claire, I don't mean to interfere. It's okay. She glanced toward the
¿Qué
house.
fue?
I just
Ay,
think you
a
deserve to
dormir. A
know
ver si hay
that he
suerte.
doesn't speak about you kindly when you're not around. The words hurt more than I
Mis
expected.
gatos son
No
iguales,
matter
como
how much
Cristian, todos los
evidence you
cables. Lo que
find,
pillan lo
betrayal
muerden.
still
Gracias,
hurts. But
gracias.
pain
Pensaba que
has a
estaba
funny
sola
way
en
of
que...
becoming fuel,
Pensaba que
and mine
estaba
was
sola.
becoming
En que
gasoline.
quiera morder
By Monday morning, I had
absolutamente
assembled an
todo.
entire file, property
Todo el
records,
rato.
attorney correspondence, financial statements, DITMAs, consultation
Me está
notes,
mirando muy fijamente.
everything,
Quiere que me calle
enough
ya,
to
pensa lo
destroy
que...
every lie he'd
Básicamente.
built, enough
Claro.
to expose him
Y
completely.
cara de
But I
circunstancia.
wasn't ready, not yet, because I wanted more than victory. I wanted truth,
Me ha
the
dejado la
whole
cama de
truth.
pelos.
And I
Cambié las
had a
sábanas el
feeling
otro
Derek
día
was hiding one final secret,
y me las
one
acaba
big
de
enough to
dejar.
explain everything, one big enough to make all the other
¿Sabéis qué es lo más
pieces fit
gracioso? Que
together.
las sábanas que
I
cambié el
just
otro
hadn't
día
found
les
it
pasé la
yet.
aspiradora
3
antes de
days
meterlas en la
later, I
lavadora
opened his
para quitarle la
laptop,
mayoría de
and
pelo.
there it was.
Quité
A
un
folder
montón
he
de
thought
pelo,
nobody would ever
pero es
see.
que
The
del
folder
filtro de
was
la
labeled
secadora he
X6
sacado
Plan.
otro
The
puñado de
moment I
pelos.
clicked it,
¿De
my
dónde
heart
salen?
started
Si ya le
pounding.
había pasado la aspiradora.
Because whatever was inside was the reason for
Uf,
everything. And I had a
no os
feeling my
podéis hacer una
marriage
idea de
was
la
about to
cantidad...
get
Bueno,
much
sí, si tenéis
uglier
gatos os
than
podéis
I
hacer
ever
la idea. La
imagined.
cantidad de
My
pelos que
hands
está
hovered
soltando,
over the
tío.
keyboard.
Por
For a
todos
second,
lados. Y ahora
I
que está
considered
ahí
closing the
flotando
laptop.
por la cama,
Some part of me still
está
wanted to
soltando
preserve
todavía más.
whatever illusion remained. 14 years is a long time, even when you're unhappy, even when you're betrayed. You don't erase that kind of history overnight. But then I remembered standing in the dining room while Derek
Poco ha
publicly
sido la
sent me to the
experiencia de mi
guest room.
vida de
I remembered the attorney
tener gato
letters, the hidden
y
debt,
probablemente
the
sea
7 attempts to
el
take
primero
my
y último
property,
gato que tenga en
and
mi
I
vida.
clicked the folder. Inside were dozens of files,
No,
spreadsheets,
no, no, no,
financial
no.
projections,
No, no
notes, legal
gestiono yo
timelines,
tener más
pre-estimates.
gatos, no.
The more I read, the
Es que ya
colder
no me
I
queda otra,
became.
¿no? Que
This
quedármelo,
wasn't a
pero
divorce plan, it was a business plan.
son
I
súper lindos,
found
mira.
projected expenses for the
He
first year
vivido
after
la etapa
separation,
de bebé de este
projected
gato,
profits from selling marital residence,
loco,
projected investment
tremenda.
returns,
Ahora estoy viviendo
projected
la primera
relocation
muda.
costs.
Venga,
Everything is carefully organized. Everything is
no.
calculated,
Tiene
including
muchas
money
partes
from a
negativas,
house
que
he
también
didn't
tiene
own.
positivas,
Then I
obviamente, ¿no?
found the final
Obviamente.
blow, a
Negativa,
photograph,
negativa.
a woman, blonde, maybe 10 years younger than me. The image was attached to hotel
Pásale la
reservations
aspiradora a
and
él.
flight
Si se la
confirmations.
dejase. El otro
A
día le estuve
2-year affair,
peinando
not 2
y la
months,
bola
2
de pelo que le
years. I
saqué.
stared at the screen.
Y
Oddly
todavía
enough,
sigue teniendo
I
más,
didn't
que es
cry.
todavía
I
peor.
expected heartbreak. Instead, I felt clarity. The
Imagínate con tres que
affair
tengo mis
wasn't the
sábanas
worst
parecen
thing
de
he'd done.
borreguito. No, no,
The
me muero, me
manipulation
muero.
was.
No.
The lies were. The years spent treating me like an obstacle in my own
Yo,
life
mi
were.
novio siempre
I
me
quietly
dice que
copied everything onto a
a Coco hay que
secure
darle un
drive.
hermanito.
Every
Pero yo tengo
file,
claro que no.
every email, every
Que
financial
con uno es
record.
suficiente.
Then I closed the laptop. When
Que
Derek
yo
came
el por
home that
dos
night,
no lo
I
veo
was sitting on
viable.
the patio
Lo
with a
siento.
glass of iced tea. He smiled.
Él quiere otro
Nice
porque no
evening.
convive
It
con él.
is. You seem different
Cuando nos
lately.
vayamos a
I
vivir juntos
smiled
y conviva
back.
con
I've
Coco, a
been
ver qué opina
thinking.
de
His
tener dos.
expression tightened. Derek never liked that phrase. What about? Oh,
Son más de
life. For
chiquito
the
ahora,
first
sí, sí.
time, I
Míralo,
watched
parece una
uncertainty
bola.
creep into his face. He sensed
Cuando
something,
se hacen
not
viejitos
enough
ellos
to know
mucho más
what,
chill. El mío se pasa
just
el día
enough to
durmiendo
feel
literal. Ya,
uncomfortable.
lo sé.
Good. Let him
Si
wonder.
este
I'd spent years wondering.
Tiene un
Now it
año
was his
y ya se le ha
turn.
notado el cambio. O
Over the
sea,
next
pasar de
month, I
ser
moved carefully,
hiperactivo total, no
quickly,
dormir
strategically.
nunca jamás,
Susan introduced me
a
to
que
a
este año
forensic
le hemos visto
accountant.
dormir muchas
The
veces en
forensic
directo.
accountant introduced me to
Dormirse encima de la
facts.
mesa
And facts are dangerous things,
y
especially
dormirse
to
con nosotros en la
liars.
cama.
We discovered
Por la
several
noche no, por la
financial
noche lo sigue llevando mal, pero
misrepresentations,
en plan, ha
nothing
cambiado, ha
criminal,
cambiado.
but enough to embarrass
Cuando ya
him
estamos un poco más relajados,
professionally,
entonces
enough to
querrás otro.
expose years
Pero si
of
el problema no es solo
deception.
la hiperactividad,
Meanwhile,
el
I met with a
problema es
divorce
que va a
attorney,
seguir
an
soltando
excellent
pelo, va a
one,
seguir cagando y
a
va a seguir
woman named
comiendo.
Rachel who listened without interrupting.
Claro,
When
no.
I finished explaining everything, she leaned
Y
back
yo
in
me
her
acuerdo
chair.
perfectamente de la
Your
etapa de
husband
bebé,
thinks
no
he's
se me ha
much
olvidado.
smarter than
Está
he
demasiado
is.
fresca.
I
Y va a
laughed,
seguir
for the
estando,
first
yo
time
creo.
in weeks. So it's not just me,
En
no.
fin,
She
vamos a darle
smiled.
caña, que me
People who
encantó.
underestimate others often make
El último
expensive
poco.
mistakes.
Increíble.
How expensive?
Un gato sin pelo.
Rachel slid a folder across her desk, potentially very. I opened it.
Ánimo.
And for the first time, I understood the full picture. The house wasn't just valuable. The surrounding neighborhood had exploded in value. Commercial developers were actively purchasing nearby properties. The land alone was worth several times more than Derek believed. My grandfather's old property had quietly become a gold mine. I sat there stunned. Years earlier, Derek must have discovered the same thing. Suddenly, everything made sense. His obsession, his manipulation, his repeated attempts to gain ownership, the pressure, the control, the lies. It was never about love. It was about leverage, and he'd spent years betting I would never figure it out. He lost that bet. The public downfall arrived 6 weeks later, completely by his own choice. Derek loved attention. I loved admiration. I loved being the smartest person in the room. His company hosted a major networking event every year. Executives, clients, community leaders. Nearly 200 guests. Naturally, Derek wanted to impress everyone. Naturally, he invited me. Naturally, he had no idea what was waiting for him. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers. Servers moved through the crowd, carrying trays of champagne. I wore a navy dress Derek had always hated. He preferred softer colors, more approachable. That night, I didn't care. Amanda spotted me first. She smiled warmly. You look amazing, thank you. You seem happy. I glanced across the room. Derek was entertaining a group of executives. Confidence, cocky, completely unaware. I am happy. And for the first time in years, it was true. About an hour into the event, Derek stepped onto the stage. The microphone amplified his voice across the ballroom. People applauded. He soaked it up, every second. Then came the mistake. The same mistake arrogant people always make. He got comfortable, too comfortable. While talking about leadership and success, he started telling personal stories. The crowd laughed. He laughed. Then he said it. My wife keeps me grounded. Although technically she's living in my house, so maybe I should get credit for that. Laughter rippled through the audience. My pulse slowed, not sped up, slowed, because I knew exactly what was about to happen. Amanda looked horrified. Several people glanced toward me. Derek grinned proudly. And then Rachel stood up, my attorney, perfectly calm, perfectly prepared. The silence arrived almost instantly. Derek frowned, confused. Rachel smiled politely. Actually, Derek, county records show the property belongs solely to Claire. The room froze. Every conversation stopped. Every face turned. Derek's expression collapsed, not dramatically, just enough to reveal panic. Excuse me? Rachel continued calmly. In fact, ownership records have reflected that status for years. The silence deepened. I could practically hear people breathing. Amanda covered her mouth. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Derek laughed nervously. There's obviously some confusion. There isn't. Rachel's voice never wavered. She handed copies of the public records to several executives standing nearby. The damage was immediate, the visible, irreversible. Because public humiliation works differently when facts are involved. You can't argue with documents. You can't charm your way around evidence. You can't dominate paperwork. especially paperwork you've spent years trying to hide. Derek's face turned pale. Then came the second blow. Rachel wasn't finished. Neither was I. A developer representative attending the event approached us. One I'd already been negotiating with privately. He extended his hand. Claire, congratulations again on the property agreement. Now people were openly staring. Executives, coworkers, clients, everyone. The representative smiled. We're excited to finalize the purchase. Derek blinked. What purchase? The man looked confused. The Willow Creek property. Derek looked at me. For the first time in 14 years, he looked genuinely powerless. The property is being sold? I smiled, partially developed. His mouth opened, then closed. The representative continued talking. The transaction value exceeds $3 million. A collective gasp swept through the room. $3 million. Derek looked like someone had punched him, because in a way, someone had. Reality finally hit him. The house he'd tried to steal. The asset he'd spent years chasing. The future he'd already counted on. None of it belonged to him, not one piece, and everyone knew it. The divorce moved surprisingly fast afterward. Men like Derek rely on control. Once they lose it, they often collapse faster than anyone expects. The affair became public. His professional reputation suffered, not because of the affair itself, because of the dishonesty, because people started connecting dots. They remembered conversations. Came. Stories the image he'd carefully built began cracking, then shattering. Amanda later told me something I'll never forget. He spent years convincing everyone he was the smartest person in the room. What happened? She smiled. People realized he wasn't. As for me, I sold part of the property, kept the original house, renovated the kitchen I'd wanted for years. Traveling, started consulting work, reconnected with friends. Most importantly, I relearned something I'd forgotten: how to trust myself. That took longer than the divorce, longer than the legal battles, longer than the healing, but eventually it happened. One quiet morning, nearly a year later, I sat on the back porch with coffee in hand. Sunlight filtered through the trees, birds moved through the garden, the air smelled like fresh-cut grass. Peace, real peace. Not the kind you pretend to have, the kind you earn. My phone buzzed. A message from Amanda. You know what people still talk about? I smiled. I already knew, but I asked anyway. What? Her reply arrived seconds later, the night he told everyone it was his house, and discovered it never was. I laughed out loud, then I set the phone aside. Across the yard stood the house my grandfather protected. The house Derek tried to take. The house that ultimately revealed exactly who each of us really was. Funny how life works. The room he sent me to that night was supposed to make me feel small. Instead, it led me to the truth. And the truth gave me everything he spent years trying to keep from me: my freedom, my future, and myself. The last time I ever saw Derek, he looked away first. That was all the closure I needed.